Okay, so here's the beat. Spoilers ahead. In case you don't recognize it, this is Bastion, a critically beloved indie game from 2011. This is the player character, known only as the Kid, and this is Zulf. Zulf was a friend of yours and a member of your community, but midway through the game he betrayed you. And you find him here, in this, the last level of the game, wounded at the hands of his own people, and have the choice to either leave him here to die, or forgive him for his transgression and take him with you. Now, the significance of this choice isn't going to make sense if I don't explain it to you, so let's see how quickly I can do that. Bastion begins after the end of the world, or at least after the end of your world. Your land is left in ruins after an apocalyptic event, and you make your new base of operations at the titular Bastion, the place your people agreed to go to, as the narrator says, in case of trouble. At first, it's just you and the narrator, both natives of this land, but over time you collect two more survivors, Zia and Zulf, both foreigners who lived within the city's walls. So while your companions start turning the Bastion into a nice little makeshift home, you set about doing your work. You see, the Bastion is not just a refuge, it's a society rebuilding machine. Don't ask too many questions about this, but if you power it up with enough crystals, it'll fix everything that's been destroyed. It will essentially rewind time to before the world ended, and everything will go back to normal. The crystals are scattered throughout the remains of your civilization, and you collect them by going to different areas and, well, destroying everything between you and them. There's wildlife and various creatures, some of whom want the crystals for themselves just as badly as you do, and others just trying to survive without intrusion, and you take them all down in pursuit of your goal. But you see, it's okay, because your cause is the more righteous. You're a force of pure destruction, but everything you destroy will be brought back when the Bastion is powered up. But that plan gets complicated when Zulf betrays you. He wrecks your society rebuilding machine and alerts his countrymen as to what you're doing. Historically, his people have been at war with your people, and they don't want your society to return, so they invade the Bastion. And in order to repair the damage that they and Zulf have done, you have to cause even more destruction in order to collect even more crystals. So that's the first half of the game, and if that's all you knew, this decision would be pretty clear-cut. You're trying to fix the world, he's trying to stop you, leave the traitor behind. But it's more complicated than that. I mean, isn't it always? In the second half of the game, you come to understand Zulf's motivations for doing what he did. It comes to light that the history of your people and Zulf's is not super cool. There's a legacy of war and strained peacetime. Despite living inside the city, Zulf and Zia were always treated with suspicion, and your city has been known to just build shit like grand railroads on other people's land and violently sort out the details after the fact. But the real doozy is that before the world ended, your people were planning a massive, like Hiroshima-level assault on Zulf's people, completely unprovoked.
It was Caelondia's master plan to wipe the Ura out. But part of that plan backfired, didn't it?
That's why Zulf doesn't want you to rebuild. The narrator keeps describing how beautiful the city was before it fell, but however beautiful, it was a city built on a history of imperialism and xenophobia. Zulf doesn't trust your people if they were brought back not to act, well, basically not to act exactly the way you've been acting. Think about it. The entire game has been you taking whatever you need with however much violence that requires. I mean, the final level is you coming to the home city of Zulf's people and laying waste to it in pursuit of one final crystal. Why would they trust you? And this raises the game's meatiest question. Should you rebuild your society? Because it's the only way to undo all the damage you've caused, but there's no guarantee the same damage won't be visited on the world by your people once they come back, if not more. So which is worse, leaving the sins of history unremedied, or repeating them? Now, that also raises the question of whether a game whose mechanics are about wrecking shit, that requires you to wreck shit and rewards you for wrecking shit, can really work as a critique of the way humans enjoy wrecking shit. But that's a can of worms I don't have room to open right now, and there's already a dozen Spec Ops articles about this. Let's get back to this beat. Zulf's people have turned on him. They hold him responsible for you being in their city. Him being in this state is kinda your fault. Do you save him or don't you? The choice itself is not actually that interesting. There doesn't seem to be any good reason not to save Zulf, and I don't know anyone who didn't on the first try. What's interesting is what happens when you save him. If you leave him behind, you just wreck everything on your way to the exit, but with Zulf in your arms, you can no longer run, nor jump, nor fight. You have, for the first time in the game, willingly removed your ability to wreck shit. You can no longer cause harm. All you can do is take damage.
I set my sail, fly, the wind it will take me back to my home, sweet home.
What does it mean to act like a hero? You take a movie like Castaway. In that movie, you see Tom Hanks form an emotional bond with an inanimate object. And if that conceit works for you, and let's acknowledge that the movie's biggest problem is that's a big if, then later in the movie, when he has to abandon that object, he feels terrible, and you feel sad for him.
Wilson! I'm sorry! I'm sorry, Wilson!
But when you, as a player, encounter a similar beat in a very famous scene of a very famous game, you abandon the inanimate object you've formed a bond with, and you don't feel sad, you feel guilty.
You euthanized your faithful companion cube more quickly than any test subject on record. Congratulations.
Now, guilt is not an easy emotion for a movie to evoke. There are documentaries that can make you feel self-conscious about how you've been living your life outside the theater. But within a fiction? Well, Michael Haneke made a movie where he accused the audience of, by virtue of watching the movie, being complicit in the violence on screen. He actually made that movie twice. But that's just it. Pretty much the only thing you can make a movie audience feel guilty of doing in the moment is sitting and watching. By and large, in books, films, plays, characters feel things like guilt and shame or pride and bravery. Audiences feel sympathy. Batman does something clever and you feel impressed. Superman's heart is breaking and you feel bad. Spider-Man does something self-sacrificing and you feel proud of him. In most media, a storyteller has access to an audience's sympathetic emotions, things that you feel in response to other people's feelings. But here, you're not proud of someone else's accomplishment. You're the one acting like a hero, and the other characters become your audience. By having the player be the protagonist, suddenly you can feel clever, or get your own heart broken, or act like a hero. Now, obviously, you're not actually doing anything brave, you're just sitting on your butt in front of a computer, but in the same way that you can empathize with a fictional character, you can take pride in a fictional act of heroism. What I'm getting at here is that there are emotions we can get our audiences to feel when we tell stories in games that we don't have access to in other media. That's not to say they're better emotions, just unique. It's a thing that games can do. And that's not in and of itself special. Every medium has its own set of tools and things to accomplish. But games are the only medium I can think of where, from time to time, in pretty regular cycles, some respected voice pipes up to say, games are a bad way to tell stories. That whatever value you've taken in an interactive narrative is not quite valid enough, because that's not what games are for. Now, I think I see where these folks are coming from. We can look again at Half-Life 2 and see a game with a set of rules for the player to operate within, and also a narrative. And that narrative stays pretty coherent provided the player goes along with it. But if the player is feeling obstinate, the story breaks in one of two ways. Either the protagonist is jumping on heads and zooming in on butts while no one bats an eye, or the designers break their own rules and allow the player to empty clip after clip into a character's face with no consequence. Either player agency makes the narrative fall apart, or the narrative is preserved by ignoring player agency. A deep exploration of a game's systems usually yields too many unforeseen circumstances to have unique authored content for all of them, so it's common that one or the other has to give. And for people whose interest in games is exploring systems, people who value purity of design, a narrative game can never be pure in the way that Tetris is pure, in the way that Go is pure. You could make a case that trying to tell a story in a game fundamentally bastardizes the medium of games. But here's how I feel. I don't think I could argue that most movies explore purity of cinema, or that most books explore purity of text. In fact, I think you could just as easily make a case that every story fundamentally bastardizes the medium in which it's told. And that's because there is no such thing as a storytelling medium. Stories always have to get filtered through a pre-existing medium, be it books or games or films or plays or just oratory around a dinner table. Each medium exists independent of stories, and telling a story typically means stepping back from a medium's full potential. Experimental works like Meshes of the Afternoon and Finnegan's Wake are what they are precisely because they are not trying to tell a coherent story.
Penetrators are permitted into the Musie Mound free. Welsh and the Paddy Patkinses 1 shilling. Redis members, invalids of old guard, find Pussy Poos Pussy Pram to sate the sort of their butt.
And that's great. Don't get me wrong. It's all great. What I'm saying is that a musical may not be a great way to explore the full potential of songwriting, but it is a neat way to tell a story, and the existence of Les Mis does not negate the existence of the Mars Volta. What's curious about this is that most pure cinema is relegated to art house theaters, and most pure prose is relegated to graduate-level postmodernism classes. And yet, in video games, projects that tell stories, and projects that explore systems with no pretense towards a story, and even projects that attempt to do both, can all of them be critically adored and economically viable. These things are sold on the same platforms, are sometimes made by the same developers. So why in games of all places does it get treated like an either-or? And while I'll concede there are a lot of stories that don't belong in the games they're in, I'm not yet convinced that all stories conflict with all systems. I value stories. I'm not saying I value them more than any of the other things you can do with an expressive medium, just that storytelling matters to me. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Human beings like stories. They're part of how we make sense of the world. And in order to tell stories, we need tools. I guess what I mean to say is that at the intersection of narrative and computation, there are these things we can do, like invite people to linger and revisit, or unsettle people with game feel, or tell a joke with a system, or compel someone not to sympathize with a character, but to feel what they would feel. And if you stripped the narrative out of these moments, they would cease to be meaningful. And if you recreated them in a non-interactive medium, they might still mean something, but they'd mean something very different. And when I come across moments like these, they excite me very much. Not because I think this is what games are for, but because I'm being told stories in ways I've never been told them before. These are tools, and they're tools that don't exist anywhere else. And it's my feeling that they're just too good not to use. Thank you for watching. This has been Story Beats.